Frederick Douglass was a prominent American abolitionist, speaker, and author. Douglass was born into slavery on a Maryland plantation in 1818 to an enslaved woman and her white master. In his struggle from slavery to international stardom as a renowned abolitionist, Douglass gave Americans a new perspective on race, education, and American democracy. After his escape from slavery at the age of 20, Douglass's life became an influential example of how through perseverance and education, freedom was possible. His true goal and desire was for Americans to live in peace and equality. Douglass's childhood plantation belonged to Edward Lloyd. Around the age of 8, he was sent to live in another plantation in Baltimore. While living in Baltimore, this is where he was mistakenly taught the alphabet by one of his mistresses. These few lessons opened up his lifelong love for education, and this later was his key to freedom. Douglass escaped slavery in an extremely risky manner. He masked himself as a sailor and boarded a train to the north with a fake passport. When he reached New York City, he became a free man. Frederick Douglass had a true talent and skill in public speaking. Douglass traveled around Massachusetts speaking out on the cruelties of slavery and the need to abolish it. William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, discovered Douglass and had him traveling the U.S. speaking out on the horrors of slavery with the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass's other risky move was releasing his book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which he released with accurate names and locations. In fear of being recaptured, Douglass changed his information and left to England for a couple years. Though there was fear of being enslaved again, the books he released were extremely popular and famous. In Britain, Douglass continued his tours, and the British, blown away by Douglass, paid for his trip back to the U.S. When he returned, he came to Rochester, New York, a rich area for abolitionist movements and change. Through the money he earned in Britain, Douglass was able to start his newspaper, the North Star, which was an abolitionist newspaper.
Frederick Douglass was an advocate for the abolishment of slavery during the Civil War that began in 1861. He reminded the United States that the war was to enforce states' rights and the importance of keeping America together. He even advised the president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, to form the Emancipation Proclamation, a document which freed all slaves. Douglass, being a man who was too old to fight for himself, also encouraged the participation of African American soldiers in the war. Douglass knew that the equality would need to be expressed on all levels for it to continue for years to come. In order to embed the idea of equality into American values, Douglass would go around the country to give speeches fighting for the rightful treatment towards African Americans. As time went by, Douglass moved to his home at Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. During his stay here, Douglass acted as the U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia, along with the District Registrar of Deeds and U.S. Minister of Haiti. Douglass, a dedicated and hardworking man, continued to fight for equality until his death in 1895.
Now we're going to show you the National Historic Site of Frederick Douglass, the place he lived in for 17 years until his death in 1895. His house was given as a memorial site by his wife after his death.
He was pretty wealthy at this point in his life, as you can see from the beauty of his estate here and the size of this house. He'd made most of his money by being a public speaker. He was a great orator, and he could make $100 per speech. By the time he moved here, he was making more than $100 per speech. That's how he was able to buy this house. This house was $6,700 when he bought it. At that time, you could buy a house for just a few $100s, so dropping $6,000 on it was a good chunk of money. That's what Frederick Douglass looked like while he lived in this house. That painting of him is pretty rare. It was done while he lived here, but Frederick Douglass preferred to be photographed. He was the most photographed American of his time, hands down, even more than Abraham Lincoln. He was photographed the most. He is rarely painted. It's hard to see that painting, just look at the reflection in the mirror makes it a little bit easier. Portrait between the windows is his wife Anna. When Frederick Douglass moved here with Anna, it was just the two of them. Their children were all grown up. They've been married for 40 years. Their children were all in their 30s by that point, so they didn't live in this house with them. A couple sons lived to the south in Berry Farm, the next community over. One son still lived up on Capitol Hill, where Frederick and Anna had lived for a few years before they moved out here. And then their daughter Rosetta remained up in Rochester, which is where they lived as a family for about 25 years. So when Rosetta came to visit, she often stayed for a long time. A lot of the children visited here, but they didn't live in the house permanently. Anna passed away pretty soon after they moved.
Frederick Douglass was a prestigious man, and that reflected greatly throughout his house. On the first floor of his home, it had three main parts that included the living room, the dining room, and his office. The main living room was where he spent most of his time with his family and loved ones. He also loved to read and play his instruments there. His office was a place where he worked on his writing. He keeps all his books neatly placed on the shelf. As you can see in the video, he had different rugs and portraits that reflected the kind of man he was. The dining room was a place where he had meetings and dinners with his family members and important political people. The second floor was all rooms having 5, one being his own and one being his wife's. At this time, spouses did not sleep in the same room as often as people in the 21st century do, leaving 3 rooms open to his children. In this time, having a 2-story house with 5 bedrooms was very expensive. The last part of his house was a shed that was built for him to get away and relax. It was a man cave of sorts. His house reaching a net worth of today's money, valuing it in about $1 million.
And it's where he's tended to do more work. His office is right there. This parlor is a little more laid back or relaxed. It's his family parlor or sitting room. It's where he spent a lot of time with his children and grandchildren when they visited. And when he played with his grandchildren, a different side of him came out that few people got to see. He's in the privacy of his home. In public, he presented himself as very serious. His life's work for equality and justice was something to be taken seriously. And if you just look at how he is posing there in that bust, how he's posing in the portrait, he's very aware of his public appearance and how people will take him seriously if he presents himself that way. But here, when he's unwinding with his family, he let his granddaughters ride on his back like he was a horse. He let his granddaughters braid his long hair and pull ribbons. He loved to play violin. This is the room where he'd do most of that. He was a great violinist. He taught himself how to play, just like he taught himself to read and write. He's a self-made man in many ways. And the Douglases hosted a lot of big dinner parties here. Frederick Douglass was a federal official when he lived in this house. He had a lot of presidential appointments. Even before he lived here, he'd been elected head of the Freedmen's Bank. He was appointed to the board of Howard University. He was appointed to the D.C. Legislative Council, which is a governing body for D.C. When he first moved here, he'd just been appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. Then he became Recorder of Deeds for the district. And finally, he was U.S. Minister and Consul General to Haiti. Frederick Douglass got all these appointments because he campaigned for presidents. He's a Republican stump speaker. He helped to raise votes for candidates when they were in office then. When they were finally elected, they appointed him positions, patronage jobs. So in turn, that meant a lot of office holders came here and dined with the Douglases. Often as dignitaries, people from other countries. You can find a lot of ambassadors came here to eat with the Douglases. When they had big dinners, they could make their table bigger, they could pull up their extra chairs. And sometimes we find evidence that they had catered dinners. So working out of these back rooms would be caterers. When we look at the table, it's set up for a small dinner. Frederick Douglass's chair is easy to pick out. It's the biggest one in the set right here at the head of the table. Frederick Douglass probably needed a big chair. He stood about 6'2". He weighed about 230 pounds. If you think about him as a public speaker, he was eloquent. He had a booming voice. And even before he started speaking, when he got up at the podium, he had that powerful physique, that imposing presence. People paid attention as soon as he got up there. He could speak for hours and his audience would be glued to it. So you look up here at this group portrait, again talking about his size. You can see at 71 years old, he still towered above other men. He's in the back row towards the middle. And he always wore his hair very long. Distinguished him. He was asked why he wore his hair so long once. He said because of Alexander Dumas, his hero, wore his hair long. So Douglass did the same. On the other side of the hallway, these are split up into his and hers. So other side of the hallway, this is where his wife Anna stayed on the left, that kind of yellowish room. To the left of the bed is a wheelchair. It's an invalid chair, that's what it was called then. Anna suffered from arthritis very badly, and then it sounds like one or maybe both of her legs didn't work too well. A couple of years before she passed away, Frederick Douglass bought that chair. She had a caretaker for 12 years of her life, so she was in pretty poor health by that time. Her caretaker's name was Louisa. I think it's a pretty safe bet to guess that Louisa lived in the adjacent room, so she could take it. The Women's Rights Convention for the first half of it. He came back here afterwards. He had dinner with Helen. He sat in his chair at the table. At about 7 p.m. he got up and he walked towards this door. He had to go give a speech at a local church, so his evening was not over yet. As he walked towards the door, he all of a sudden collapsed in this hallway. He was suffering from a heart attack. and he passed away very quickly. A doctor did try to come in and revive him, but it was too late. He slipped away. His wake was held here in this house, here in this parlor. Hundreds of people passed through these hallways to pay their respects, and then thousands of people went to both his funerals. He had one downtown at Metropolitan AME, which still stands. He'd spoken there a lot in a secular sense, and then he'd also attended there. He'd attended services there. You can find his name on the bench still where he used to sit.
Throughout Douglas's 77 years of life, he not only exceeded the expectation of the typical African American, but also overwhelmingly surpassed any abolitionist. Through his own struggle to freedom, his ceaseless dedication, and his perseverance for racial equality, Douglas progressed the civil rights era tremendously.
Baby, can't you see